It's Dr. Page. I'm the best guy to see on the worst day of your life. And if you're at home and wanting some encouragement from the Bible, wanting to know what the Bible says about maybe what you're facing with the coronavirus, I want to just remind you that you're not alone. And the first thing I want to tell you is a story about perspective. I just got back from Africa serving in Niger. And I want to just remind you that if you're in the Western Hemisphere in the United States, it could always be worse. And that's one of the things I realized, as I'm there taking care of these kids with chronic malaria and anemia, malnutrition, who come in with these typhoid perforations, which is a rare complication of typhoid fever. And you operate on them, and man, they just get sicker and sicker and sicker, and they die. And in Africa, there are no resources. If you have a lung infection, whether it be a pneumonia or an interstitial pneumonitis that they talk about with coronavirus, you die. There is no ventilator. There is no oxygen. And so just keeping that in mind and keeping that in context, what you're here with in the United States is that there are resources. So let's stop and keep things in perspective and count our blessings, because we do have resources. But what I want to focus on in this Bible study is not so much focusing on the resources, but really focusing on the source. And I want to tell you another story. When I got there, and what I'm doing in Africa is I go every once in a while and I train surgeons over there. I'm really just taking the place of surgeons, missionary surgeons who are there, training African surgeons to serve in Africa. I'm never going to change Africa, but if I can influence these young doctors to make a difference in their world, then they will be the ones that change Africa. But anyway, I walk into Niger, which is in the Saharan desert, into this small hospital where we're training residents, and there is another resident that was there. It was such a blessing to me. His name was Olivier. And Olivier actually is training at Bongolo Hospital down in Gabon, which is down the Congo River, 3,000 miles away. I had no idea that it was going to be there, but it was such an encouragement to me because it reminded me of a story. Olivier and I went through some tough times together. We delivered triplets there at Bongolo Hospital, 26 weeks triplets that survived. And then also there was this story of this lady. Olivier called me one night, and he called me and he said, Oui, merci beaucoup, Dr. Chuck, you have to come quick. A lady had fell on her machete. It was an 80-year-old lady that a machete had lacerated her axilla up in here. And she was bleeding to death. And here I am in the middle of Africa, my first week there, and I'm trying to figure out, oh my goodness, what have I gotten into? Well, I get there, and of course, there's blood on the floor. The patient's in the operating room. There's no anesthesia. Once again, no resources. And I begin, and Olivier's holding pressure on this lady's armpit. And I just begin to go nuts. I can't find any suture, the right kind of suture, or 4-O-Proline to fix the lacerated artery. There's no clamps. The scrub nurse is oversleeping in the corner. That was actually the circulator. There was no scrub nurse. It was just me and Olivier. And finally, anesthesia walks in and flip-flops and looks at the patient and then turns around and leaves. And then here's this patient that's crashing, bleeding to death, and it looks like everything's falling apart. And I'm just about to lose it. And I'm thinking about all of the resources that I don't have. And Olivier stops and he begins to pray. And I'm kind of ticked off at Olivier anyway, because I don't think it's really the right time to pray. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all about prayer. But Olivier was like, man, this lady's bleeding to death. We need to fix this problem. But sure enough, Olivier let out this long prayer. And, he was just an intern, just a young doctor. And he said, we love you, O Lord, our strength. And as he was praying. And so Olivier went out and washed his hands. And, kind of frustrated. I was holding pressure till Olivier could come back in. Then I went out and washed my hands. And I began to think about Olivier's prayer. And, I love you, O Lord, my strength. And I began to think about that. And I said, well, who prayed that? And that's Psalm 18:1 from David. And as I began to think about David, I began to think about how did David defeat Goliath with a little stone and a slingshot? I mean, he had no resources. But you know, to David, that really didn't matter. And as I began to think about that and how David, fell that giant with a sling and a stone, it wasn't about resources. It was about the source. You see, David was connected to the source of his strength and the source of his hope and all of those things. And so as I began to think about that, and even think about Moses, how did Moses bring the people out of Egypt? I mean, he used a stick of all things because, God could have really used anything that he wanted to use. And I think we need to realize that here in the West as we begin to think about maybe the lack of resources with the coronavirus and where we're at. Just remember, let's always remember to go to the source. God is all we need, and everything we need has been given to us based upon the completed work of Christ. And so starting from there, and so what this Bible study is about is going back and looking at the source. If you feel alone, if you feel isolated, you're in the right place. If you feel inadequate to face the challenges maybe that you're going to be facing with the coronavirus, you're in the right place. We're going to go through some passages, just some simple passages, and then give you some questions that you can answer and journal as you're kind of there, maybe isolated at home. So anyway, welcome to the Bible study, and we'll be giving you the next video here, and it'll have a Bible verse, and we'll be meditating upon that verse and talking about that verse, and then you can kind of begin to journal some of these things and meditate upon some of God's promises that'll help you when you feel these feelings of isolation and loneliness and inadequacy and all those kind of things. So in the next video, we're going to discuss what the scriptures tell us about loneliness. And I want to remind you that you are not alone. And we're going to talk about the difference between loneliness and isolation. So click below for the next video and we'll begin the study. Dr. Page, the best guy to see on the worst day of your life.